Hi, and welcome back to the wonderful world of the scientific hypothesis. My name is Brad Alger. Many scientists think about the hypothesis mainly in the context of an NIH grant application. And this should be a good thing, but unfortunately, they often make mistakes in organizing their applications. In this video, we'll cover three common mistakes that reviewers cite when they reject applications, and we'll see how to go about avoiding those mistakes. I can't promise you that your next grant application will be funded, but if you follow the advice in this video, it will be a better application. So here is a list of common mistakes made in NIH grant writing. We'll go over each one of them individually, and then we'll see how to avoid getting these negative comments. A common criticism is that a grant is diffuse and unfocused. This is the kiss of death in a grant review. Any grant that gets them is dead. Now, what exactly does diffuse and unfocused mean? Well, for one thing, there is no central, coherent, consistent theme. There are too many ideas in there. Parts of the grant are not related to each other. These are good ideas, but they're not obviously connected. The proposed experiments don't test the hypothesis that's put forward. That is, the experiments can't actually falsify it. And finally, it's not infrequently the case that a supposed hypothesis is just there for show. It's not really a hypothesis at all. In this video, we're going to look at the made-up problem of the fish dying in the lake and the different sorts of ways grants might approach that. In this grant, there's a hypothesis which says something in the water is bad for the fish. The significant statement is that the reasons for the fish dying are not well understood. And the proposed experiments are a bunch of different methods and techniques that are going to be used to investigate the problem. Aim 1 states that they will characterize the lake water for changes in pH and O2 levels that could affect fish. Aim 2 is to carry out genetic analyses of fish to look for possible deficiencies in O2 requiring enzymes. And Aim 3 is to perform behavioral and electrophysiological tests to determine effects of lake water on fish nervous systems. Now let's break this down. This vague statement in the beginning that says it's a hypothesis is not really a hypothesis. It's a general statement which isn't readily testable. The significant statement is trivial and uninformative. Of course, the reasons are not well understood. That's why they wrote the grant. And similarly, we understand they're going to do the experiments in order to investigate the problem. The biggest issue, however, is the specific aims. It is a collection of different projects which are only loosely connected to each other and the main theme of the grant. They seem to be randomly selected and disorganized. And therefore, even though they're said to be aims that should be related to the hypothesis, they do not actually test the hypothesis. So this is an example of a loose, unfocused, and diffuse grant. So on the opposite end of the spectrum from diffuse and unfocused is a grant which is well focused, but it's far too expansive. It has an unrealistic scope. So here's an example of a grant that shows that kind of problem. The grant has an overarching theme that contamination of lake water is harming fish. This is somewhat more specific than the first time, and similarly, the significant statement also points to environmental problems. Most importantly, the grant is focused on three specific hypotheses and will test predictions of each hypothesis to determine if any can be eliminated. So this grant already is much more focused than the first grant we saw. Now this grant goes on to propose specific aims. The first aim is that acid rain is responsible for the fish death. The experimenters will test pH of the water, of the rain. They'll find the source of the pollution. They'll characterize the lake fish species and analyze the sensitivity of the fish species to pH changes. In Aim 2, they'll consider the possibility that low oxygen levels in the lake are responsible for the fish death. They'll do a careful analysis of the O2 levels throughout the lake, laboratory analyses of fish oxygen sensitivity. And finally, in Aim 3, they'll investigate the possibility that pathogens in the lake are responsible for the fish death. They'll do a genetic reconstruction of the total lake microbiome and analysis of the species distribution of the microbes. You can see right away that the problem here is that the grant, although it's well focused, is far too expansive. There's really no possibility that in a reasonable amount of time, one laboratory is going to be able to conduct all of the various analyses using all of the techniques and so on in the time allotted to it. This is far too expansive, and in general, the grant suffers from having way too much in it. Now you might say, well, what's wrong with having too much? If you have too many ideas, why is that a problem? The problem here is that although the overall strategy might look good and make some sense, more is not better. Reviewers know that you will not be able to do it all and do it all well, and they also don't know, therefore, what it is you're really going to do. And to evaluate the grant, that's what they need to know. The result is you have a grant which looks naive and impractical. It's carelessly put together because it seems to include every idea you've ever had in your life, and therefore it's not very well planned. A far better strategy is to focus on what you can realistically do with the time and resources that are allotted. You need to think carefully about each experiment, how long it will realistically take, and what you can realistically accomplish in the time that you have. It's probably okay to be a little bit too expansive. This shows your ability to think about the problem and the possibilities of the approach, but don't go overboard. It's better to put big, ambitious ideas into future directions. This shows that you're aware of the larger issues and that the grant topic is important and has long-range relevance. A completely different but also common problem is the problem of linked aims. That gives rise to the criticism that if aim 1 fails, then you have nothing. Basically, the grant looks like a house of cards. If you take out just one card, the whole thing collapses. And here's an example of a grant that fails, not because it's not focused enough, but that it's too focused and that the aims are linked. The hypothesis is that the lake is toxic because of acid rain. The significance is very narrowly defined. It's the acidity of the lake water is an important parameter for fish health, and it states the range of pHs, which is okay for fish. The rationale is that the acidity of the lake water has not been well characterized, and therefore the grant has 3 aims. Aim 1 is to characterize lake water pH with the newest dyes and optical methods. Aim 2 is to determine what the source of the acidity is by measuring the acidity of the clouds, the prevailing winds, and the amount of precipitation, and so on. And finally, the third aim is to take steps to correct the lake water acidity and reduce pollution levels. While these might individually sound like okay things to do, there's a big problem with it as a grant, and that is, what happens if Aim 1 fails to detect an unhealthy pH? There is no grant. There's no reason to proceed any further with the other aims, and that means that the aims do not accomplish a thorough test of the hypothesis. Here's a better way to set up the grant. There's an overarching theme, which is at least a bit better focused on environmental changes, and a significant statement, which also makes sense. Most importantly, though, the grant is focused on 3 major hypotheses, but not in a broad general way, but instead on 3 specific key predictions of each hypothesis to determine which, if any, can be eliminated. Focus is much better. Now in Aim 1, the acid rain hypothesis will be tested by measuring the pH of the water throughout the lake and in the rain. For Aim 2, the O2 levels will be measured again throughout the lake. And finally, for Aim 3, common pathogens in the water will be tested. The aims are clearly focused on the hypotheses, but they're more limited to the key predictions of each hypothesis. Importantly, the aims are all independent, but they're also all closely tied to the main theme. The aims, therefore, are not linked. Eliminating one hypothesis does not invalidate others. There are major hypotheses, and even finding that they're all wrong would be progress. Future directions would involve following up the hypothesis or hypotheses that are not eliminated with future tests or additional possible causes of the fish death. To avoid common mistakes in grant writing, first of all, most importantly, focus on one problem, ideally a genuine testable hypothesis, but investigate related but distinct aspects of that problem. If you have a hypothesis, test several separate predictions of the hypothesis. They will be related but not linked, and so even if one is false, the others will be worth doing. No single test can be conclusive, and that's another reason to do multiple tests. And finally, any test may be fallible. Ideally, you'll have at least 2 or more independent hypotheses to explain the same phenomenon. And finally, keep in mind that it's important not to propose to do too much. This will help make your grants be focused and substantive, but not unrealistic. Thanks for watching. Remember to give it a thumbs up if you like it and subscribe to hear more. See you next time.